Imagine being born second in line to the most powerful throne on earth. Your grandmother is Queen Victoria, ruler of an empire where the sun never sets. You're called Eddie by your family, Prince Albert Victor by the world. You're handsome, charming, beloved by the public. You have everything a man could want in the 1880s: wealth, status, privilege beyond imagination. And then, slowly, methodically, your life unravels. Whispers follow you everywhere. Scandalous rumors, accusations of perversion, madness, even murder. By the time you're 28, you're dead under mysterious circumstances, and within hours, your rooms are being cleared, your papers burned, your very existence being erased from history. Some say it was influenza. Others whisper it was poison, or syphilis, or insanity. The royal family never spoke of you again except in the vaguest terms. This is the story of Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, the heir who became too dangerous to let live. To understand what happened to Prince Albert Victor, you need to understand the weight of the crown that should have been his. You need to understand the Victorian obsession with moral purity and the absolute terror of scandal that governed every breath the royal family took. And you need to understand that in the late 19th century, certain truths about a man could destroy not just him, but the entire institution of monarchy itself. The British royal family in the 1860s wasn't just powerful, they were the symbolic heart of the largest empire in human history. Queen Victoria ruled over nearly a quarter of the world's population. Her empire stretched from Canada to India, from Australia to vast swaths of Africa. The British pound was the global currency. The Royal Navy commanded the seas. And at the center of it all was Victoria herself, the grandmother of Europe, whose children and grandchildren would marry into nearly every royal house on the continent. But Victoria's reign was built on more than military might and colonial exploitation. It was built on an idea: moral superiority. The Victorian era was defined by its rigid moral codes, its obsession with propriety, its conviction that the British were not just politically dominant, but morally superior to the peoples they ruled. The royal family had to embody these values perfectly. Any hint of scandal, any whisper of impropriety, could shake the foundations of empire. Queen Victoria herself had transformed the monarchy's image. After the debauched reigns of her uncles, George IV and William IV, she and Prince Albert had created a new model: the royal family as moral exemplars devoted to duty, family values, and public service. When Albert died in 1861, Victoria's grief was so profound that she withdrew from public life for years, wearing black for the remaining 40 years of her reign. The cult of Albert became the cult of Victorian respectability itself. By the time Prince Albert Victor was born in 1864, the expectations were crushing. He was named after his grandfather, the paragon of virtue. He would be raised to rule an empire. Every aspect of his education, his behavior, his public image would be scrutinized. The pressure to be perfect was absolute. But here's the thing about pressure that intense: it doesn't always create diamonds. Sometimes it creates fractures that can never be repaired. Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward was born on January 8, 1864, at Frogmore House in Windsor. His arrival was 2 months premature, unexpected, and alarming. The tiny infant wasn't expected to survive his first night. His mother, Princess Alexandra of Denmark, had been ice skating when she went into labor. The shock of the premature birth sent the royal household into chaos. No preparations had been made. The infant prince was so small, so fragile, that doctors gave him little chance. But Albert Victor survived. He would forever be called Eddie by his family, to distinguish him from all the other Alberts in the dynasty. His younger brother George arrived 16 months later, in June 1865. From the beginning, the two princes were inseparable, raised together, educated together, dressed in identical sailor suits that became iconic images of Victorian childhood. Their father was Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII. Bertie, as he was known, had spent his entire life disappointing his mother. Victoria never forgave him for the scandal that she believed had hastened Prince Albert's death. Bertie had been caught with an actress, and the stress of the scandal, Victoria insisted, had weakened Albert's health before his fatal illness. Bertie was kept from any meaningful royal duties, excluded from government papers, treated as perpetually untrustworthy. He responded by throwing himself into pleasure. Beautiful women, endless parties, gambling, horse racing, elaborate practical jokes. He was everything his father had not been. Their mother, Princess Alexandra, was one of the most beautiful women in Europe. A Danish princess, she had been selected for Bertie, partly because Denmark was Protestant and conveniently not too powerful. She was deaf in one ear from childhood illness, and by her 20s she would develop a stiff leg from rheumatic fever that gave her a distinctive gliding walk that society women actually tried to imitate. Alexandra was devoted to her children, perhaps excessively so. She dressed Eddie and George in identical outfits well into their teenage years. She couldn't bear to let them grow up, to let them leave her. The boys lived in Marlborough House in London and Sandringham in Norfolk. These weren't just houses, they were monuments to wealth and privilege. Sandringham alone sprawled across 20,000 acres. The main house had over 270 rooms. There were armies of servants, gamekeepers, gardeners. Every meal was an elaborate production. Every outfit was tailored by the finest craftsmen. The princes wanted for nothing materially. But Eddie was clearly different from birth. He was languid, dreamy, often seeming to drift through life in a fog. While George was energetic and focused, Eddie appeared perpetually distracted. He had a long face, heavy-lidded eyes, and a peculiar way of holding his neck slightly forward that made him appear to be constantly straining to understand what was being said to him. Some historians have speculated he might have had a learning disability, perhaps dyslexia or attention deficit disorder, conditions that wouldn't be understood for another century. His education was a disaster from the start. John Neil Dalton was appointed as the prince's tutor when Eddie was 7. Dalton was a stern clergyman, convinced that rigorous discipline and classical education would shape the boys into proper rulers. For Eddie, it was torture. He struggled with Latin and Greek. His attention wandered during long lectures on history and theology. His handwriting was atrocious, his spelling worse. Dalton's reports to the Prince of Wales were damning. Prince Albert Victor requires the stimulus of Prince George's company to induce him to work at all. The implication was clear. Left to himself, Eddie was lazy, unmotivated, possibly stupid. What nobody seemed to consider was that Eddie might simply learn differently, that the rigid Victorian educational methods might not work for every child, even a prince. Instead, Eddie internalized the message. He was a disappointment, inadequate, not as good as his brother. In 1877, when Eddie was 13, a decision was made that would shape the rest of his life. The princes would join the Royal Navy, serving together on the training ship HMS Britannia. It was meant to toughen them up, to give them discipline and purpose. For 3 years, Eddie and George lived the life of naval cadets, rising at dawn, learning seamanship, navigation, gunnery. Then in 1879, they were assigned to HMS Bacante for a 3-year voyage around the world. It was an extraordinary journey. The princes visited the West Indies, South America, South Africa, Australia, Japan, China, Singapore, Ceylon, Egypt. They were teenagers seeing the empire their family ruled, witnessing the reality of British power and the peoples under British dominion. Eddie's diaries from this period reveal a young man capable of observation and sensitivity, curious about the cultures he encountered, though his prose remained laboured and awkward. But the voyage also meant 3 years away from any real education. When Eddie returned to England at age 18, he was hopelessly behind his peers academically. George would return to naval service, finding purpose and structure in military life. But Eddie, as the heir, needed a different path. He needed to be prepared to rule. In 1883, Eddie was sent to Trinity College, Cambridge. It should have been his chance to catch up, to develop his mind, to prepare for kingship. Instead, it became something else entirely. Cambridge in the 1880s was not the serious academic institution we imagine today. For young aristocrats, it was a playground. The wealthy young men who attended rarely bothered with lectures or exams. They were there to make connections, to drink, to gamble, to pursue whatever pleasures they desired. And Prince Albert Victor, freed from the rigid structure of naval life and his parents' direct supervision, discovered pleasures that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Eddie was popular at Cambridge. He was charming in person, genuinely kind, generous with his money. He joined the right clubs, attended the right parties, but he also began to develop a reputation. He was seen with inappropriate companions. He stayed out late, returning to his rooms at dawn. There were whispers about his friendships with certain young men, whispers that would grow louder over the years. J.K. Stephen became Eddie's tutor at Cambridge, assigned to try to improve the prince's hopeless academic performance. Stephen was brilliant, a prize-winning poet and scholar, but also deeply troubled. He suffered from violent mood swings, possibly bipolar disorder. In 1886, he suffered a severe head injury that seemed to worsen his mental instability. But in 1883, when he first met Eddie, he was at the height of his powers, and he became utterly devoted to the prince. The relationship between Eddie and Stephen has been the subject of endless speculation. Were they lovers? Close friends? Did Stephen's obsession with the prince drive his later madness? We'll never know the full truth because, like so much of Eddie's life, the evidence was destroyed. What we do know is that Stephen wrote poetry that seemed to reference a doomed love, that he suffered a complete mental breakdown after Eddie's death, and that he died in an asylum in 1892, having starved himself to death. But Cambridge gave Eddie something else too, access to London, just 60 miles away by train. And in London, in the shadows of the greatest city in the world, Eddie found a secret world that would ultimately destroy him. Victorian London was a city of stark contrasts. The wealthy lived in grand townhouses in Mayfair and Belgravia. They attended the opera, dined at their clubs, rode in carriages through Hyde Park. But just streets away was another London. Overcrowded tenements, gin shops, brothels, opium dens, places where people did anything to survive. And there was another hidden world too, one that existed in the shadows because Victorian law made it a crime, punishable by hard labor or even death, the world of homosexual men who gathered in secret clubs, molly houses, private rooms where they could be themselves without fear of arrest. In July 1889, a scandal exploded that would come terrifyingly close to Prince Albert Victor. The Metropolitan Police raided a house at 19 Cleveland Street in London's West End. What they found shocked even hardened investigators. A male brothel, where telegraph boys and other working-class youths were procured for wealthy clients. Under interrogation, the boys named names: aristocrats, army officers, members of parliament, and they named someone they called Victoria, who was rumored to be of the very highest rank. The investigation was quickly suppressed. Powerful men intervened. Some suspects fled to the continent. Others were quietly warned. The police commissioner himself seemed determined to limit the damage. But rumors spread through London society like wildfire. Prince Albert Victor had been a client of the Cleveland Street brothel. The heir to the throne was a sodomite. Was it true? The evidence is circumstantial but disturbing. Eddie was in London during the period when the brothel was operating. He had been seen in the West End at odd hours. His name was mentioned in at least one police report, though that report mysteriously disappeared from official files. The Lord Chancellor himself intervened to prevent certain testimony from being heard in court. What we know for certain is this: the royal family was terrified. Not just concerned, terrified. The Prince of Wales personally met with the Prime Minister. Letters flew between Marlborough House and Windsor Castle, and a decision was made. Eddie had to be gotten out of the country immediately, before more evidence could surface, before the scandal could spread. In October 1889, Eddie was sent on an extended tour of India. The official reason was diplomatic. He would represent the Queen at state functions, strengthen ties with the Indian princes. The real reason was to put half a world between the prince and the Cleveland Street investigation. India should have been a fresh start. Instead, it became the setting for another scandal that would deepen the crisis surrounding Prince Albert Victor. Prince Albert Victor arrived in India in November 1889, accompanied by a small entourage of officers and servants. The tour was meticulously planned. Visits to the Viceroy in Calcutta, tiger hunts with Maharajas, grand durbars where Indian princes would pay homage to the representative of the Queen Empress. It was meant to be a triumph, a demonstration of imperial power and the unity between the British Crown and its most valuable possession. But Eddie was miserable. India was overwhelming. The heat, the crowds, the endless formal ceremonies. He wrote homesick letters to his mother, complaining of boredom and discomfort. And he wrote other letters too, letters that would become a crisis requiring royal intervention at the highest level. Among Eddie's entourage was a young cavalry officer whose name has been carefully erased from official records. What we know is that this officer became Eddie's constant companion during the India tour. They rode together, dined together, retired to Eddie's private quarters together. And Eddie wrote him letters, passionate letters, letters that could not be explained away as ordinary friendship between military men. Somehow, accounts vary, these letters came into the possession of someone who understood their value. Blackmail was threatened. The letters, it was claimed, were explicit enough to destroy not just Eddie, but the entire royal family. If they were published, the scandal would make Cleveland Street look like a minor indiscretion. The Prince of Wales was informed. He was, by all accounts, apoplectic with rage. His son had learned nothing. Despite the Cleveland Street crisis, despite the warnings, despite being sent halfway around the world, Eddie had created another catastrophic scandal. Francis Knollys, the Prince of Wales's private secretary, was dispatched to India to deal with the crisis. The blackmailer had to be paid off. The letters had to be recovered and destroyed. And Eddie had to be brought under control, by force if necessary. The exact details of what happened next are lost to history. Official records were destroyed. Private correspondence was burned. But we know that a substantial sum of money changed hands. Some accounts suggest as much as £20,000, equivalent to over £2 million today. The letters were supposedly recovered and destroyed, though rumours persisted for years that copies had been made, that someone still possessed evidence that could bring down the throne. Eddie was summoned to a meeting with the Viceroy himself. What was said in that meeting is unknown, but Eddie emerged shaken and subdued. The rest of his India tour was completed under much stricter supervision. He was never left alone. His correspondence was monitored. And when he returned to England in May 1890, he found that his life had fundamentally changed. The royal family's solution to the Eddie problem was simple, or so they thought. Marriage? If Eddie were married to a suitable princess, the rumours would stop. A wife and children would prove his normality, his fitness to be king. The scandals would be buried, forgotten, dismissed as youthful indiscretions. But there was a problem. Eddie didn't want to marry. Or rather, he couldn't marry the person he wanted to marry. In the spring of 1890, Eddie had fallen in love. Her name was Princess Hélène of Orléans, daughter of the Count of Paris, pretender to the French throne. She was beautiful, intelligent, vivacious, and completely impossible. Hélène was Catholic. The Act of Settlement of 1701 explicitly barred anyone in the line of succession from marrying a Catholic. If Eddie married Hélène, he would have to renounce his claim to the throne. More than that, Hélène's father was politically toxic, a French royal claimant who actively plotted to overthrow the French Republic. An alliance with the Orléans family would create a diplomatic catastrophe. But Eddie was in love, perhaps for the first time in his life. He proposed to Hélène at a summer house party. She accepted. They made plans. Hélène even met with Queen Victoria, pleading to be allowed to convert to Protestantism so the marriage could proceed. Victoria was sympathetic but firm. The marriage was impossible. The Church would not accept Hélène's conversion as genuine. Parliament would revolt. The entire constitutional settlement could be threatened. No, absolutely not. Eddie was heartbroken. For months he sulked, refused other matches, wrote passionate letters to Hélène declaring his eternal love. But gradually, pressure from his family wore him down. He had duties, responsibilities. The scandals hanging over him meant he had no leverage, no ability to defy the family. By the autumn of 1891, Eddie had agreed to consider other candidates. A list was drawn up of suitable Protestant princesses. But the family had a different idea, one that would solve multiple problems at once. Princess Mary of Teck was the daughter of the Duke and Duchess of Teck. Her mother was Queen Victoria's first cousin, making Mary technically royal, but the Tecks were poor by royal standards. Mary's father had been forced to live in exile in Italy for years because of his debts. Mary herself was sensible, educated, dutiful, and desperate for a good match. She was 24 years old, considered practically on the shelf by Victorian standards. Mary had been in love with Eddie's brother George, but George was a second son, not yet in line for the throne. Mary's family pushed her toward Eddie instead. A future queen consort was infinitely more valuable than a naval officer's wife. In December 1891, at a house party at Luton Hoo, Eddie proposed to Mary. She accepted. The engagement was announced on December 7th. The press celebrated. The public was delighted. The scandal of Cleveland Street, the whispers about India, all seemed to fade away. Eddie would marry, settle down, become a proper heir. The crisis was over, except it wasn't. In the autumn of 1888, while the Cleveland Street scandal was brewing, another horror had gripped London. Jack the Ripper. 5 women, all prostitutes working in the desperate poverty of Whitechapel, were brutally murdered. Their throats were cut, their bodies mutilated in ways that suggested the killer had anatomical knowledge. Despite a massive investigation, the Ripper was never caught. The murders stopped as abruptly as they had begun. In November 1888, Mary Jane Kelly was killed in her room in Miller's Court, her body so savagely mutilated that she was barely recognizable. And then, silence. No more murders fitting the Ripper's pattern. The killer had either died, been imprisoned for another crime, or left the country. For decades, the Ripper murders remained unsolved, a source of endless speculation. Dozens of suspects were proposed, investigated, dismissed. But in the 1960s and 1970s, a new theory emerged, one so scandalous that it seemed almost designed to sell books rather than uncover truth. Prince Albert Victor had been Jack the Ripper. The theory went like this. Eddie had contracted syphilis from a prostitute in the East End. The disease drove him mad. In his insanity, he stalked and murdered the women of Whitechapel. The royal family knew but covered it up, using their power to protect him. Some versions claimed Eddie's tutor, J.K. Stephen, was his accomplice. Others suggested a massive conspiracy involving the royal physician, the Freemasons, even Prime Minister Lord Salisbury himself. The theory was nonsense. Eddie had solid alibis for most of the murder nights. He was in Scotland, staying at country houses with dozens of witnesses. His health, while not robust, showed no signs of advanced syphilis. And the psychological profile of the Ripper, methodical, controlled, capable of melting back into the East End crowds, was completely unlike Eddie's known personality. But the theory persisted because it touched something in the public imagination. The idea that beneath the respectable surface of Victorian society, beneath the pomp and ceremony of royalty, lurked depravity and madness. The theory said something people wanted to believe about the corruption of privilege. And there was another reason the theory wouldn't die. Eddie's name had become synonymous with scandal. Cleveland Street, the India letters, the persistent rumors about his private life. By 1890, a portion of the public was willing to believe almost anything about Prince Albert Victor. His reputation was so damaged that even wild accusations seemed plausible. The truth was that Eddie was not a murderer. But he was something the Victorian establishment found almost as threatening. He was a sexual deviant in the language of the time. His desires, his relationships, his very nature posed a threat to the moral foundation on which the empire claimed its legitimacy. And that made him dangerous. Christmas 1891 at Sandringham should have been a celebration. Eddie was engaged to Mary of Teck. The wedding was planned for February 27, 1892. The guest list included crowned heads from across Europe. Westminster Abbey was being prepared for a ceremony of unprecedented magnificence. The scandals seemed to be fading into the past. But Eddie was not well. Those who saw him at Sandringham remarked that he seemed subdued, almost depressed. He had lost weight. He complained of feeling tired all the time. Some attributed it to pre-wedding nerves. Others whispered about the real reason, the weight of secrets, the strain of living a lie. On January 7, 1892, the day before his 28th birthday, Eddie joined a shooting party in the bitter cold. It had been snowing for days. The temperature was well below freezing. Eddie's father, the Prince of Wales, was an obsessive hunter, and Eddie felt obligated to join despite feeling unwell. That night, Eddie developed a fever. At first, it seemed like a simple cold. The royal physician, Dr. Francis Laking, prescribed rest and fluids, but the fever worsened. By January 9th, Eddie was delirious. Dr. Laking diagnosed influenza, which was epidemic in England that winter. Influenza in 1892 could be deadly. There were no antibiotics, no antiviral drugs. Treatment consisted of bed rest, cold compresses to bring down fever, and hope. For healthy young adults, recovery was expected. But Eddie's health had never been robust, and his fever kept climbing. Mary of Teck rushed to Sandringham. She sat by Eddie's bedside, reading to him when he was lucid, holding his hand when he wasn't. Princess Alexandra was distraught, convinced her son would recover, refusing to accept the doctor's increasingly grim prognoses. By January 13th, it was clear Eddie was dying. His lungs were filling with fluid. Pneumonia had set in, a common complication of influenza. He gasped for breath, his skin turning blue from lack of oxygen. Doctor. Laking sent for specialists from London, but there was nothing they could do. In the early morning hours of January 14th, 1892, Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, died at Sandringham House. He was 28 years old. His mother, father, brother George, and fiancée Mary were at his bedside. His last words, according to those present, were, "Who is that?" as he stared at something no one else could see. The official cause of death was influenza complicated by pneumonia. The death certificate was signed by Dr. Laking and Dr. Alan Manby, who had arrived from London. There was no autopsy. Eddie's body was embalmed immediately and placed in a coffin that was sealed within hours. And then something extraordinary happened. Eddie's rooms at Sandringham were cleared, not slowly, not carefully, but frantically. His papers were gathered up and burned, his letters, his diaries, his personal correspondence, all of it was destroyed. His clothes were packed away. Within 48 hours of his death, it was as if Prince Albert Victor had never lived at Sandringham at all. The speed with which Eddie's effects were destroyed has fueled speculation for over a century. What was in those papers that needed to be burned so urgently? What secrets died with Prince Albert Victor that the royal family was so desperate to hide? The official explanation was that it was normal procedure, that royal privacy required the destruction of personal papers. But George V, when he became king, preserved his papers. Queen Victoria's diaries and letters survived. The systematic destruction of Eddie's entire written legacy was unusual, deliberate, and suspicious. Some historians have suggested that the papers contained evidence of Eddie's homosexual relationships, correspondence that would have destroyed the royal family's reputation if it became public. Others have speculated about medical records showing syphilis or other venereal disease. Still others believe the papers revealed Eddie's involvement in scandals even worse than those we know about. There's another theory too, one that emerges from the timing and circumstances of Eddie's death. The wedding was 6 weeks away. The royal family was committed to a marriage they knew was a sham, designed to hide Eddie's true nature. If Eddie had lived to marry Mary, what would have happened? Could he have maintained the pretense for years, decades? Or would there have been more scandals, more crises, each one threatening to bring down the monarchy itself? Influenza killed tens of thousands in the winter of 1891 to 92. Eddie's death from the disease was not inherently suspicious, but the circumstances raise questions. He was kept at Sandringham, isolated from outside observers. The doctors were all royal appointees, loyal to the family above all. There was no autopsy. The body was sealed in a coffin within hours. The evidence of his life was systematically destroyed. Could Eddie have been allowed to die? Could treatment have been withheld, or inadequate care provided because his death solved a problem that his life had made intolerable? We'll never know. What we do know is that the royal family's reaction to Eddie's death was not just grief, but relief. It was the relief of a crisis averted, a danger past, a threat eliminated. Princess Alexandra was devastated by Eddie's death. She turned his rooms at Sandringham into a shrine, preserving them exactly as they were on the day he died. For the rest of her life, she would live until 1925, she observed the anniversary of Eddie's death with elaborate mourning rituals. She wore black. She wept. She spoke of her darling Eddie as if he had been a perfect son, a future king who would have been magnificent. It was a fiction, but a necessary one. Alexandra could not acknowledge the truth about her son, could not admit that his death might have been a mercy for the monarchy, even as it destroyed her heart. The Prince of Wales grieved too, but differently. He had spent years trying to control Eddie, to manage his scandals, to prevent his son's nature from destroying the family. Eddie's death was a tragedy, but it was also a solution. The problem that had haunted Bertie for years was gone. And then there was George. Poor George, the second son who had never expected to be king, who had built a life in the Royal Navy, who had loved the sea and the structure of military life. Suddenly, George was the heir. He would have to leave the Navy, learn statecraft, prepare to rule. The weight of the crown that Eddie had carried so poorly now fell on George's shoulders. But George did something Eddie could never have done. He accepted it. He threw himself into duty with the same discipline he had brought to naval service. And 18 months after Eddie's death, George married Mary of Teck, the woman who had been engaged to his brother. The marriage was initially controversial. Was it proper for George to marry his dead brother's fiancée? But Queen Victoria approved, and Victoria's word was law. Mary, who had been raised to be queen consort, would fulfill that destiny after all. She would become Queen Mary, one of the most formidable consorts in British history, the grandmother of Queen Elizabeth II. George and Mary's marriage was solid, dutiful, productive. They had 6 children, including the future Edward VIII and George VI. George became King George V in 1910 when his father finally died. He ruled through World War I, guiding the monarchy through the greatest crisis it had faced in centuries. He died in 1936, having transformed the British monarchy into the modern institution we know today. Would Eddie have done the same? Could he have been the king Britain needed in the 20th century? The answer is almost certainly no. Eddie lacked his brother's discipline, his sense of duty, his ability to subordinate his own desires to the demands of the crown. More than that, Eddie carried secrets that would have made him vulnerable to blackmail, to scandal, to crisis after crisis. Eddie's death, tragic as it was, may have saved the British monarchy. That's the terrible irony at the heart of this story. For over a century, the full truth about Prince Albert Victor has been obscured, hidden behind destroyed documents and official silence. But enough evidence survives to piece together the outlines of his tragedy. A young man born into impossible privilege, burdened with expectations he could never meet, living with a nature that his society deemed criminal and perverted. Eddie was not stupid, though he was often called that. He was not evil, despite the wild theories that made him Jack the Ripper. He was not even particularly scandalous by modern standards. His crimes were loving the wrong people, being attracted to men in an era when homosexuality was illegal, and failing to conform to the rigid masculine ideal that Victorian society demanded of its princes. But in the 1890s, these failures were unforgivable. Eddie's nature, his sexuality, his inability to play the role assigned to him, these things made him a threat to the very foundations of Victorian morality and imperial power. The British Empire claimed to rule the world because it was morally superior, more civilized, more Christian than the peoples it conquered. A homosexual heir to the throne shattered that claim. It revealed the hypocrisy at the heart of Victorian moral superiority. And so Eddie had to be erased, not just from physical existence, though his death accomplished that, but from history itself. His papers were burned, his letters were destroyed. Official biographies barely mentioned him, except as a footnote. For decades he was the forgotten prince, the heir who was never king, whose brief life was reduced to a few lines in history books. But Eddie's story refuses to stay buried. Every few decades, new theories emerge, new books are written, new attempts are made to understand who he really was and what really happened to him. Because his story touches something fundamental about power, privilege, and the price of being different in a society that demands conformity. Think about what Eddie lost. He never got to rule. He never got to marry the woman he loved. He never got to live openly, to be himself without fear. He spent his entire life under surveillance, under suspicion, under the crushing weight of expectations he could never meet. And when he died, he was erased, as if his existence had been an embarrassment that needed to be hidden from history. The Cleveland Street scandal happened in 1889. 133 years later, same-sex marriage is legal in the United Kingdom. A gay man can serve as Prime Minister. Indeed, Leo Varadkar served as Taoiseach of Ireland, and other openly gay leaders have governed democracies around the world. The laws that criminalized Eddie's relationships have been repealed and condemned as barbaric. But in 1892, Eddie lived in a different world. A world where his nature was a crime, where his desires could bring down a dynasty, where the truth about him was considered so dangerous that it had to be buried along with his body. Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward was more than a scandalous footnote to Victorian history. He was a real person who suffered, who loved, who tried to meet impossible expectations and failed. He was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. He He was a human being trapped by circumstances beyond his control, destroyed by a society that had no room for who he was. The weight of the British crown was supposed to be his birthright, his destiny. Instead, it was his death sentence. The privilege that seemed to promise him everything actually gave him nothing, except a prison of expectations, secrets, and lies that he could never escape. When Eddie died at 28, the royal family mourned, but they also moved on remarkably quickly. Within 18 months, his brother had married his fiancée. Within 20 years, he was barely mentioned in official royal circles. Within 50 years, he had become a ghost, a rumor, a scandal that people whispered about but never fully understood. But Eddie's story matters because it's a reminder that mental health, identity, and the right to live authentically are not luxuries. They're necessities. No amount of privilege, no amount of wealth, no amount of power can compensate for being denied the right to be yourself. Eddie had palaces, but he was imprisoned. He had wealth, but he was impoverished. He had a name that opened every door in the British Empire, but he was trapped in a life that gave him no freedom to be who he really was. And in the end, that contradiction destroyed him. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, died on January 14, 1892. His funeral at Windsor Castle was attended by royalty from across Europe. He was buried in the Albert Memorial Chapel at Windsor, beneath an elaborate tomb designed by Alfred Gilbert that took 14 years to complete. The tomb shows Eddie in the uniform of the 10th Royal Hussars, surrounded by saints and angels, frozen forever at 28. But the real Eddie, the complicated, troubled, human Eddie, was buried long before his body was laid to rest. He was buried under official lies, destroyed documents, and the silence of those who knew the truth but would never speak it. We'll never know everything about Prince Albert Victor. Too much was destroyed, too much was hidden. But we know enough to see the tragedy clearly. A young man who never had a chance to be himself, who was crushed under the weight of expectations and secrets, who was ultimately more valuable to his family dead than alive. The British monarchy survived Eddie. It survived because he died before his secrets could destroy it. George V was a successful king. George VI guided Britain through World War II. Elizabeth II reigned for 70 years, becoming the second longest reigning monarch in British history. The Windsor dynasty endured and even thrived, but it endured at Eddie's expense. His life was the price of the monarchy's survival. His erasure from history was the cost of maintaining the fiction of royal perfection. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories from history's forgotten corners. Prince Albert Victor deserves to be remembered not as a scandal, not as a footnote, but as a person. A flawed person, certainly. A troubled person, absolutely. But a person nonetheless, who lived and loved and suffered and died, and whose story tells us something important about the price of privilege, the danger of secrets, and the human cost of demanding that people be something they're not. The weight of the British crown couldn't protect Eddie from himself, from his society, or from a family that ultimately decided he was too dangerous to let live, or at least too dangerous to let his secrets survive. Whether he died naturally of influenza, or whether his death was hastened by neglect or design, the result was the same. The problem was solved, the monarchy was saved, and Prince Albert Victor became the heir who never was, the king who was never crowned, the man who was erased from history almost before his body was cold. Some say it was mercy, others say it was murder. The truth, as always with the British royal family, remains locked away in archives that will never be opened, in documents that were burned a century ago, in secrets that died with everyone who knew them. But Eddie's story survives. It survives in the whispers, the theories, the endless fascination with the prince who was too scandalous to remember, but too intriguing to forget. It survives as a reminder that privilege without freedom is a prison, that secrets always have a cost, and that sometimes the weight of a crown is not an honor, but a curse that destroys everyone it touches.